Hey friend, Chris here from MyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Today, I want to dispel a Logic Pro myth that has been perpetuated again and again and again, usually by folks who don't use or know the application that well, but maybe receive the occasional set of audio files from a Logic Pro user for mixing or producing or what have you. And the myth goes something like this. Logic cannot bounce or export mono audio files, but can only bounce or export stereo audio files, even if the track is mono itself that you're trying to bounce or export. And this is a fallacy. This is not true. You absolutely can bounce mono audio files to your heart's content, export them side by side with stereo audio files. It really just takes getting to know the bounce and export dialogues and their nuances and how the mixer and channel strips interact with these dialogues. So in today's video, I want to show you a couple different circumstances to watch out for. And we're going to do this using both audio track types and software instrument track types. And I'm going to show you, you can absolutely do this. Bookmark this video if you've ever needed it. Let's dig in. Cool. I have 4 different tracks in this project. They're all based off of Apple loops. And the first track here is an audio Apple loop. And if we take a closer look, this is a snare drum. We have 4 hits. And this is, for all intents and purposes, a mono audio file, a mono region, and a mono channel strip. And we know this based on a couple different visual cues. First, if we take a look at the region here, we can see a single zero crossing line, which has a single set of waveforms for the snare hits along that zero crossing. If we also take a look at the channel strip itself here in the inspector or mixer, we can see a single circle in the input section here, which stands for a mono channel strip. It's the channel mode. So at the input stage of this channel strip, it is mono. And if we take a look at the level meter down below, we see a single narrow meter, which indicates to us as well that this is a mono channel strip at the output stage because we don't see a wider level meter, which accommodates both a left and right hand side of a signal. If we take a look at the track below right here, this is in fact the same exact snare drum as what's up here. All it is a stereo bounce of that original snare. Because with this region, we actually see not just 1, but 2 sets of zero crossing lines with 2 sets of waveforms for each side of the snare audio file or region. So a left and a right hand side. And if we take a look at the input section for the channel strip, we see not 1, but 2 interlocking circles, which means at the input stage, the channel mode is set to stereo. And if we take a look at the level meter down below, it is a slightly wider level meter. So we're working with a stereo region and a stereo channel strip through and through. And then if we take a look at the software instrument here that I have, which is using Alchemy, we can't tell based on the region that it's stereo or mono because all we see is MIDI data. And we also can't look at the input section because software instruments don't show us a channel mode in the input section. But you can take a look at the level meter. We see, again, a slightly wider level meter for a left and right hand signal. And if you click on the last plugin in the audio effects chain on the right hand side, we can see that that plugin is set to a stereo instance. Or you can just click on an empty slot as well. And I would just, take a look at an EQ. So there we have it, stereo. So out of the gate, there's a lot of visual clues. Now I'd like to prove to you that this snare is identical to the second snare. First, let's take a listen to the mono snare and just get a sense for what it sounds like, and then we'll listen to the second snare that's in stereo. Okay, you get a sense for what it sounds like. We can see that it hits about negative 3.9 on the peak meter. Let's now take a listen to just the stereo version. Sounds about the same level for the peak value. If we now play both side by side, and if I have a gain plugin on one of these tracks, and I invert the polarity on that gain plugin, if these are identical, they should cancel out because I've inverted the waveform. Take a look here. You can see that this waveform goes down and up, down and up. This waveform as well goes down, up, down, up. So by using this gain plugin, I've changed the direction of this first waveform. Instead of going down, it goes up. Instead of up, it goes down. So it's the exact mirror opposite. So let's take a listen and see if we hear anything. If we don't, they're the same. Okay, so we see that there's level, but they cancel each other out because, again, the polarity has been inverted. So they're identical. The only difference is that I bounced this region in place to be stereo. And that's how we ended up with a stereo version of the snare. But if we take a look at the multimeter and look at the goniometer and the correlation meter, you're going to see that, in fact, the snare is mono, regardless of the fact that the region's stereo. And you could tell because the goniometer is just showing us a line straight up and down. It's not veering to the left or to the right at all. And the correlation meter is pinned all the way to the right. Okay, all well and good, but the problem is that we've created a stereo file from a mono file, and that's what we don't want to achieve, right? At this point, you got to start to get to know the channel strips and how they can affect whether a track is mono or stereo. We take a look at the snare here. We can see again that the input section is set to mono. If you click and hold on the channel mode options, you get a drop down that allows you to switch the input of a channel strip from mono to stereo, or from stereo to mono, or just the left side of a stereo signal, or just the right, or switch it to surround. So if we switch the input section to stereo, the gain plugin has also been switched from a mono plugin to a stereo plugin, meaning that even though we have a mono region in audio file, our channel strip, for all intents and purposes, is now stereo. But because the region's in mono, it still sounds like it's in mono. We just got to get rid of that gain plugin because now only one side is phase inverted, as you could hear. All right, so now if we bounce this region in place or export it, let's go to File, let's go down to Bounce, Region in Place or Track in Place. In the dialog here, I'm going to leave everything off, all of the different options. We're just going to bounce in place based on the fact that I've changed the input and the output to stereo. We now have a stereo audio file in region. So that's one way you can change the orientation of a track when you bounce or export. We can go in the other direction. We can switch this to mono. Just with a single click, you can change the channel mode very quickly. And if we bounce in place again, we've switched back to mono. Next up, you can also change the orientation of a track using the plugins in the channel strip. So we can see we have a stereo track. Let's switch it back to mono for now. Single click brings us back to mono, changes the gain plugin to mono. Now, if we try to bring in a new plugin like an EQ, we're offered the option to bring in a mono EQ. But if you hold Option and click on the right-hand side of the audio effect or an empty audio effect slot, we go to that channel EQ instance, we can now switch it from mono to stereo or from stereo to mono. So if we switch this to stereo, we now have a stereo channel strip once again. And if we bounce in place, there we have it. The resulting bounce and export is in stereo. So let's do this in the other direction. Let's select our stereo track here, and let's change the orientation just using the plugins. So we can switch from a stereo channel EQ, hold Option, click, to mono, and we can bounce in place. And now we have a mono bounce. From here, you can change this orientation on a per plugin basis. We've gone from stereo to mono, and if we now hold Option and click, we can introduce a reverb to stereo. And this can be really helpful when you're working with a stereo bass that's really just mono, or a stereo, snare sample that's really just mono. You can switch it on a per plugin basis or in the input section. Or in the case that you want to create some stereo with using a reverb or delay or modulation, you can do that too. So let's listen to the snare and drive up Chromaverb. Let's solo it. Cool, and if we bounce in place, we have the snare with those audio effects. Do you get a sense for what's going on? So now if we get rid of Chromaverb, and let's leave the channel EQ mono in this instance, and with this first track, let's leave the orientation set to stereo, even though it's mono. If we now go to File, go to Bounce, Tracks in Place, and we're going to just make sure to not bypass the effect plugins. If we hit OK, look at that. Mono to stereo, stereo to mono. But still exactly the same. There's also another detail that I guarantee is really the crux of why folks get into this problem of only producing stereo audio files, And this is the volume or pan automation option in the export or bounce dialog. And if we go to the bounce or export dialog, we have this option to include volume or pan automation. And just remember, this is a mono region, a mono audio file. And in fact, there is no panning automation or volume automation. Nonetheless, when we include this option right here, when we hit OK, watch this. Oh snap, we've created a stereo audio file yet again when we bounce or export because of that one option to include volume or pan automation. And I guarantee you this is what trips people up the most, that they don't know that they're including this, and this is causing every file to turn into a stereo bounce or export. Now, it doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, we have no panning automation. Why is Logic creating a stereo file? Well, the fact of the matter is it does make sense, because if we did create some sort of panning automation and we pan each snare hit, to the left, to the right, so on and so forth, do that. When we bounce this region or track or export, to be able to include pan automation, we need the resulting bounce to be in stereo. So if we click OK and take a look, now it makes a lot more sense. Logic is just following your orders. It doesn't know that you haven't written any automation to some of these regions. If we back it up, get rid of all our automation, it doesn't know that there is no automation. It's just trying to make sure to include automation by creating a stereo file, right? So if we select all our tracks, go to File, go down to Export, and if we export these 4 tracks as audio files, and we'll just export this to the desktop, and I'll create a new folder, and we'll just call this Exports. As long as we make sure to not include volume pan automation, and we export, and if we squash this up, let's go to the desktop here, Exports, and if we bring these guys in, if we zoom in, we have a mono file, a stereo file, stereo, and stereo. So in fact, Logic did bounce a mono file because, again, that channel strip is mono through and through. And we made sure to not include any pan or volume automation as an option. Boom. So that is the option that is getting in the way of a lot of folks and causing this sort of myth that Logic Pro can't export mono files. It boils down to these details. Now, real quick, let's just deal with software instruments because they are a slightly different case, not by much, but slightly. In this case, we have Alchemy. We don't have a channel mode. We can't select. We can adjust the orientation of a plugin, but let's wait to do that. If we click on the right-hand side of Alchemy, if we take a look at some of the instruments in Logic Pro, some of the instruments provide you the option to choose either a mono or stereo instance. We look at drum synth. If we look at, obviously, the ESM, it's a monophonic synth. If we take a look at sampler, we have mono, stereo, multi-output, and 5.1. But Alchemy only offers a stereo instance of this instrument, meaning we can't switch it at the input, which means we have to option click that last plugin in the chain or an empty plugin slot and introduce a plugin as a mono instance. So in this case, let's just introduce a gain plugin, held option, click, bring in a mono gain plugin. Boom, now we switched it to mono. And if there were no plugins on here, we're just going to get rid of all these. Just option click, bring in that gain plugin. Boom, we switched it. And now let's export this instance of Alchemy. And we'll export it just to the desktop. We'll make sure to not include volume pan automation. Export. Go to the desktop. Bring in that festival chord. And it's in mono because of the change in the channel orientation thanks to the gain plugin. In a nutshell, what this all means is when you go to export or bounce your tracks in place or out of Logic, if you want mono channel strips and tracks to stay mono, just make sure to disable the option for include volume pan automation and hit OK. Mono tracks will stay mono, stereo will stay stereo, and then select the tracks that have panning automation that you want to include. Select those separately and export or bounce those in place separately. So I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, as always, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel, Why Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, whylogicprorules.com. Every week I'm posting new videos, emails, or posts to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Thanks so much.